That's family.
How would you like to be remembered? What would you like people to say about Dominic Marino?
Oh, that I cared. I might not have been right all the time, but I tried my best. I think that it's probably most important that you. I once told someone that when I live my life, I don't want to ever lay down on that last day and say I wish I did something. So for me, I want to do everything in the world once and the things I like twice. And then I want to do a cartwheel and right into the casket and say, mission accomplished, I'm done. I don't want to be carried in a wheelchair, and I don't want to say I wish I did something. So if I'm successful in my life, I've done everything in the world once and the things I like twice. And then I'm in good enough health to do that cartwheel right into the box, and then I'm done. And then I hope people can say, wow, he had fun along the way. He cared about a lot of people. He was an honest guy, and he took care of his family.
Dominic, can you tell us a little bit about some of these pictures?
Sure. I like having pictures up because it helps me remember the family. It also helps me tell the stories to my kids. So it's we have this up all over the house, and these particular pictures are a mixture of my mom's side of the family and my dad's. And this is Uncle Nino as a young boy in his young teens, and my dad as a little bit older, maybe in his 20s, in Queens. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is my dad and I getting ready to go to church. And if you notice, we had the fedoras, the matching fedoras of the time. This picture was 1960s, late 60s. And my kids laughed because my dad wears a fedora today. And I actually went back and bought one to show them what it looked like. So I have my own fedora. And my dad and I recreated this picture last Easter. That's my mom and her brother, Francis, who you don't hear much about. My mom had a younger brother who passed away at an early age, and he's remembered in a handful of pictures and a few sketches my grandmother drew of him that we have. That it's such a painful memory. We only heard a few stories about him. And in her later years, she could talk about the loss of her son. And Grandpa, frankly, never. Grandpa Rapisardi just couldn't do it. So this is one of the pictures of Francis, and you always wonder who he would have grown up to be. Knowing my uncles, my grandmother's brothers, it's a wonder. They turned out to be such a great family. These are another collage of pictures. This is Grandpa Rapisardi, and this is fascinating to me because I never knew of him as an outdoorsman. So when you peruse these photo albums, this is Grandpa in the mountains in Europe, and he's hiking or skiing, snowshoeing it looks like at that time. And I've never seen a picture of my grandfather with hair. So my only recollection of him is bald. And if you look closely, he's got the face of my cousin Nico Finichiero, who hopefully we'll capture on a video. And Nico is Grandpa's brother's son, so this is his uncle. And he has the exact face of him. Speaking of my grandfather's brother Enzo, this is Enzo here. And I got to meet him on a trip to the United States in the 70s, late 70s he came across. He was drafted into the Italian army and trained to be a pilot. So this is him in North Africa. And unfortunately, at that point, the Italians were fighting with the Nazis at the time. So there's several pictures, his military pictures of him along with Nazi officers flying what looks like a bicycle with a lawnmower engine. This was the Italian Air Force back then. These planes were made of wood. They were pretty fragile. I've shown this to several airplane buffs that were just asked for copies of this. They think it's the most amazing picture that these things ever flew in battle. So he would fly and just look. It was an open cockpit. If you notice his leather helmet and goggles. He was quite reserved about his service to the Italian army and his cooperation with the Nazis. It was something it plagued him. You could see it in his face. He rarely spoke of it. He obviously loved America and loves his brother, who was living in the United States at the time. And back then, he was a young Sicilian farm boy who was drafted into service. So he didn't have much choice at the time, but he did his part. He was captured in a North African campaign and held as a POW. So this is his military picture at the time he was serving. My mom is up here as a cheerleader, and that very much depicts my mother. My mom would write columns for the school newspaper, for the local newspaper. She was very active in high school, and she was very proud to be a cheerleader. We see pictures of her like this and pictures of her in a poodle skirt. She was a very active, outgoing person, and that was her at Levittown High as a cheerleader. These other pictures are of my mom's side of the family. That's my mom with her grandfather, Salvatore Costa. Very few pictures of him because he traveled quite a bit as an artist, and again, didn't spend much time at home, but he was a very elegant person, obviously a very artsy person, and that type of personality type. Everyone I hear that describes him that way. They didn't get to know him. He's a little aloof, a little bit of a pained, struggling artist, but did magnificent work for the church. He painted, and this is their wedding picture in the town, Catania. And that's my mom visiting the in-laws up here.
Salvador, are those the pictures I see at your dad's place?
Salvatore Costa is the artist who painted many of the pictures at my dad's place. My mom and dad's house is adorned with many of those pictures, so hopefully you got those. But this is my mom over here and Grandma Rapisardi, and they're visiting the family in Sicily. Okay, let's see what we have over here. So this is more of my dad's side of the family, but it's a mixture. This is Grandpa Marino and Grandma Marino. And as a child, your memory of Grandma Marino is that right there. Grandma was a robust woman with white hair to me. I'm sure if you asked Uncle Nino and my dad to remember their mother, they might not have the same description, but my recollection of Grandma Marino is that right there, what you see, her face, the big smile. I might have mentioned, but when she comes in a room, you kind of knew it because she had that stature about her, and then she'd look over at you and you make a charge towards you with her thumbs out and grab you by the cheeks. And I've demonstrated this to my kids over and over again, how she'd pinch your cheeks and almost lift you off the ground. You're on your tippy toes, screaming, "Faccia bella," and just squeeze your cheeks. So that's Grandpa Marino and Grandma right there. And here they are as a family, Grandma and Grandpa Marino with my dad. And I believe that's the famed Plymouth that my dad loved in 1942 or 46 Plymouth. I believe that was the vehicle that he eventually, as my grandpa would say, he would come out every day and lick at the car. He'd lick at the car. My dad's a big car buff. This is my mom and dad as a young couple dating. And this is a picture of Grandma and Grandpa Rapisardi, I believe with my mom as a baby in that picture in Queens. And a lot of these pictures are in Queens. And you see how nice the city looked back then. This is my grandfather, whose military picture at his mid-teen years. He signed up and he was in the Italian army, I believe in artillery. And you notice the picture's posed with a cigarette in the hand because that's what they did back then. Very formal picture. And his riding, his calf protectors and his crop and his equine brush, because he did a lot with horses. I have all that equipment downstairs and I've saved it. These are the DePrima. This is Baldassare, and these are some of the DePrima side of the family here. And these are Grandpa Rapisardi's mom and grandmom there. So that's Pietrina and Francesca, and that's where those names come into the family. Claire Pietrina is my daughter, her middle name, and Francesca, my Aunt Pierre named her daughter after. Massimo was the last name there.
How did you get these photographs?
Our family's pretty good about pictures, thankfully. We're a big family, photographic family. My father got me into that. My mother's side of the family, my first camera was my mom's box camera, and she's the one who taught me how to use the box camera that you focused, and I still have it. The Brownie, I think it was called back then. And once I mastered that, I got an Instamatic 15 with a cube. But the Brownie had a flash bulb that when it went off almost started a fire. I can remember once I ejected the bulb and I went to pick it up. I thought I was going to burn the skin off my hands. So it was a mini explosion would occur. And you took a flash, you were blinded for a period of time, and you almost burned the house down. But that was how you used those cameras back then. And eventually, you'll see just about everyone in the family is a photographic buff. And this last shot over here is Grandma and Grandpa on their wedding day. So you can see the young couple. And they right before World War II broke out, got married. So they did their honeymoon, and Grandpa barely got out of Italy as a young man of fighting age. He risked being drafted into the Italian service, but they got out and came to America. And we'll see some pictures of what it was like for them to enter as Italian immigrants right before a war. So these pictures of my dad's family, this is my dad as a young boy. And it's one of the few pictures we have of my dad as a young boy. I asked my dad about that, and Grandpa too, and he said back then pictures were a big deal. You dressed up, you put a suit on, you went to a studio, you got your picture taken. Other than that, no one took a picture. Unlike today, when kids are eating breakfast, we take a picture. We probably shoot hundreds of pictures a year of our kids doing the most mundane things. Back then, it was a big deal, and you did it once every few years. You put on a suit, you went to the studio, and this is my dad here as a teenager, probably about 13 or so. There's Uncle Nino as a young boy. There's Grandpa and Grandma all dressed up and getting their studio picture taken. And this just happened to be my dad as a young boy. So there's very few good quality pictures back then that were taken. Most people couldn't afford cameras. So this collection of the different wedding pictures of the grandparents, and this is Grandpa Marino and Grandma Marino on their wedding day. And it's probably the only picture where Grandma Marino I've seen with black hair. So it's kind of fascinating to me right there. Grandpa changes very little through the years. He's got the same facial expression in every picture. My mom and dad on their wedding day. This is Grandma and Grandpa Rapisardi on their wedding day. And Grandma told me incredible stories about this picture. The nervousness of sitting in the apartment, waiting for the church bells to ring to signify the wedding, and the infamous walk. She had to walk 1 block down there, and the thought, should I be doing this, should I not? As she approached Grandpa, and then she told me about this. She posed. So when I went to visit that town, I made a point of doing that, is to stand where my grandmother stood in that window and look at the view and think of the story she told me at the time. And this is Grandma and Grandpa as a couple, young couple. And again, one of the rare pictures where you see Grandpa Rapisardi with a full head of hair.
In this room, I think we'll call you Nikki. Can you tell us about some of the stuff you've got here?
This is my office, and I'd like to tell you, I apologize that it's messy today, but it looks like this about every day. And one of the things you can see is I like to remind myself of things, and I save memorabilia or objects that are important to me from my past, and it helps me reflect, and it's fun, you know, to look over here and see a typewriter that just looks like a typewriter, I guess, to you, but to me, this is the typewriter that my grandmother would tell me stories of what it was like when she came across as an immigrant. She spoke English, but she functioned as a translator at a bank, and she was very proud of that job. She was an executive assistant, if you will. And
this is Grandma Rapisardi.
Grandma Rapisardi, yeah. Grandma Rapisardi would function at the bank as a translator. So when young Italian couples would come over and they needed loans or financial transactions, she would translate, as she would say, for the executives. No matter how important the executive was, they would have to call her in, and she would speak to the immigrants and translate in Italian, and she would type up things. And this paper actually is something she had in the typewriter. So I saved her typewriter because I can remember the passion, the stories she told me, how important this was to her. And because my kids don't know what a typewriter is anymore, so they come down here and look at it and want to know, what is this device and how did one use it at the time? So this is my grandmother's typewriter. That's Uncle Joe's flag from the military. Uncle Joe's flag has 48 stars on it because that's how many states were available.
Talk to the camera.
That's how many states were available at the time. There were 48 states, so that's why Uncle Joe's flag only has that many stars on it. Cub Scouts were very important part of my life building, and my mom and my dad both played a role. So my original Cub Scout uniform I keep, and I have the full uniform, as you could imagine, the kerchief and everything. So when my daughter Grace wanted to dress up for Halloween, she put on my Cub Scout uniform, and we have this great picture of Grace, which tells me how skinny I was back then. Wearing it. This is my grandfather, who's a big, Grandpa Marino, a big equine buff. Horses were very important to him, animals in general, but horses specifically. And this was his gear. This, if you look at it, 1927, from the military, this is what he used to clean his military horse, and his riding gear for his calves to protect his legs. And again, even up until his latest years, he would come to the Thomas School and watch my kids ride, and you could see it in his face. He was really most at ease around horses, probably more so than people. These objects are from my grandmother Rapisardi's house. Grandpa and Grandma Rapisardi's house was full of collectibles. I think that's probably where I got it from. And these came from Uncle Joe mostly. So these are, I guess, alabaster. These are his trips to Africa. And Uncle Joe was the world traveler of the family at the time. So we would go to Grandma's house for the weekend, and one of the projects we would do to occupy ourselves, there was only one TV and it wasn't allowed to be on other than after dinner, was to take out a statue, take out the horse statue. We would have a lamb, and we'd sit around the table. Each kid had a statue in front of it, and we were given an amount of time to think of a story. So you had to concoct your own story. Who was this person? right here, and everybody had to tell an interesting story, or the elephant, and I have several of these around the house. Tell the story about the horse. As I recollect, Ninette would always grab the horse because she was the big horse buff. So those are mine, and I tell my kids about that. I can imagine kids trying to entertain themselves with a statue and tell a story these days with all the other things they have. That's Uncle Joe, and this is his driver's license from Ghana. Again, the world traveler. Grandma had endless stories of Uncle Joe. She really lived a lot of her life through his stories and his experiences. That's my guitar, and I remember sweating over that. I'm always fascinated because my daughters all have musical talent. Claire plays the piano, continues to play the piano, I should say. And I've told her repetitively, I took guitar lessons for years, and I could never play music. I just tell her I stunk. So I toiled over this guitar for many years. I took many lessons from John Denver to Jim Croce lessons back then by my poncho-wearing instructor, and I could never make music. So I always envy people that can do that, and this reminds me of those times.
That's not your cheerleading costume, is it?
I'm an Auburn grad and a proud Auburn fan, so I bought, at the time it was for Grace, but each of the kids has worn that little cheerleading outfit. All of this, all of this represents my life. Just about everything up here. This is Francis, who passed away, Grandma and Grandpa's son. But behind that, you'll see 1977 Mets program, and we have a wonderful picture of my dad, Uncle Ralph, little Ralph, and my dad going to the Met game that day. That is from that day, and if you look at the players back then, you'll see some famous Tom Seaver and names like that. But that was an important part of my life, and I have that picture of us standing in front of the car. My mom dressed us up in the Met outfits, and we took a picture of us right before we went to the game, so that was fun. Cub Scouts, my mom was the art one of the family, so here she is with these. This is one of these Cub Scout projects, and I can remember sitting with her making this, and everyone was fascinated. It was a Christmas ornament, and it was made of a tin can made of a tuna fish can, and this hung on our tree growing up, and it hangs on my tree to date, and my kids look at it and say, why are you saving this? But it's important. My mom and I made that together, and we made this together. This is the big rocket from the Cub Scout tournament. We had to carve this out and put it together. My mom and my dad helped me, and it didn't look very good. It wasn't attractive, and some of the dads were engineers, and they made carpenters, and they came in with rockets that looked absolutely amazing. They looked phenomenal, and I looked at this, and I was really disappointed because my dad's a pediatrician, and my mom did her best, but our rocket looked terrible. But when it came for the rocket race, when the end of the day came, we won first place for the fastest rocket. And there you are, 1974. Cub Pack 211, and we had the fastest rocket, so it was a proud moment there. My parents always taught us to take care of your things, they'll last forever, and that's a testament to what you see up here. We went to the Harlem Globetrotters, and I went with a bunch of kids, including my best friend back then, Ralph Parisi. And Ralph comes down here periodically and can't imagine, I still have my ball from the Harlem Globetrotters with my name on it. So my father taught us, you don't ever take your toys in at the end of the night, keep it clean, and it'll last forever. And this thing is from when I was 10 years old, so this is a good 38-year-old basketball that I can still play today. These items are also kind of some fun items. My parents bought us all a stationery set for our little kid office in our bedroom. And I saved this because I had the frog stapler. And the famous story about the frog stapler was I was playing with my sister Ninette. And we were playing the frog game, and the frog game involved me sticking my finger under here at my sister's instruction, and then she would slam it down and try to catch my finger as I pulled it out. And I would show you who was the smarter kid at the time. And she got me. She launched a staple right into my finger, and I sat there crying, and I went to my dad, and my dad, I woke him up. I remember him being asleep thinking to himself, what did you kids just do? He looked at me like I was insane, because I just woke him up out of sleep. I'm showing him a staple. I'm screaming in pain, explaining how Ninette shot this into my finger. And he took his teeth and bit out the staple, spit it out, and said, go back to bed. And I remember thinking that really wasn't what I thought he was going to do. It wasn't based on what I saw Marcus Welby do on TV, but it worked. And this is my dad's famous hat. We had the hat to go to church, and this was the work hat. So we did work around the backyard. Pop would get dressed up, and he'd put his, it doesn't fit me too well, but he'd put his fedora on, and we would do work around the backyard. This was the hat you wore when you did gardening, or you did some heavy work hat, so I've saved that. This was a gift from my grandpa Rapisardi. So when he retired from the barbershop, we had a retirement party. Each kid bought him something. And after he died, my grandmother gave this back to me. She said it meant a lot to him. It even looked like him, bald with the gray hair around the sides. So my favorite book growing up was this one. And what's fun about having all these cool items is this book sat here on my shelf for years. I didn't think much of it. The Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing by Judy Blume. Until Grace came in here one day and said, I can't believe it. We got this book in school we're reading. And I remember seeing this on your shelf. And she came in here and found it. I forgot about it. And she pulled it off my shelf and said, I'm reading the same book you read as a kid. So it was, I didn't even know she noticed this on my shelf. But it's one of the reasons why this room is kind of cool. Looking over here, this is from my mom. My mom was the den mother, and the gold ribbon meant she was the head den mother. So she was the big cheese when it came to den mothers, and that was my mom's uniform. She had her own Boy Scout uniform. Yeah, we talk about personal responsibility and that kind of thing. And when I was a kid, it wasn't unusual for a young kid to be given a knife. I can't fathom doing it these days, but this was my knife, and I got this knife. It says in 1974, so at 10 years old, my dad, for my birthday, went out and got me a knife, because that's what little boys did that were Cub Scouts, and you would whittle. I tell my girls I whittled as a kid, and they laugh at me. They said, don't tell anyone you whittled. But I kept this knife clean, I kept it sharp, and I used to go in the woods and kill hours whittling things. I'm not even sure what I was doing, but I was whittling. And I wore it on my belt proudly. And I was 10 years old, and Claire actually asked me recently, can I have a knife? And I said, I don't know, are you responsible enough to have one? And she said, I don't know. And I said, it's a good question, because it starts with responsibility. I don't think my father just one day walked up to me and handed me a knife. It took some experiences growing up, and I was 10 years old. I reached that level where he said, you're responsible enough, and he laid a trip on me about this knife. You could lose a finger. If you need to see some kids who lost a finger, I'll bring you to the operating room, I'll show you. It came with a whole lot of pressure not to screw up, and it meant something. And I still have my knife, and I still keep it clean as a whistle. My grandfather, Grandpa Rapisardi, was the comedian of the family. And I mentioned that he had several tricks, and I inherited the famous trip of all, his famous yakety-yak teeth, and no one could break up a room more than Grandpa Rapisardi. So he would take these wind-up teeth, and these still work, but I'm not going to wind them up for you. And there they go. And he'd sit there and pop these out on the dining room table at a Thanksgiving dinner. So he would pretend he was coughing, and then he'd throw these things on the table, and they would jump around the table like this. And Grandma Rapisardi would be screaming, Jack, put that down. And she would be mortified because he broke code with ethics. Not ethics, etiquette, I should say. He broke etiquette code. And these things would chatter on the table and everyone would bust a gut. He could take down a room in a second with a pair of teeth. And this is my memory of Grandpa Rapisardi. As I moved down here, I mentioned the Cub Scouts. This has always stayed with me. I grew up with this in my bedroom. I used to read it every night, and my mom and dad, Cub Scouts was more than just doing things. It was a way of living, and I promised to do my best, to do my duty, guard my country, to be square and obey the law of the pack. That was the code. And this I took to college with me. Unfortunately, it got a little bit cracked, and it stays with me in my work bedroom, because if you kind of remember this, you'll stay pretty straight in life. Grandpa Marino, I keep saying my father's work ethic, and then it becomes Grandpa Marino's work ethic, and then it becomes Leonardo Marino's work ethic. But work ethic transcends one person if you really believe in it. And this is Grandpa Marino's badge from Grandview Dairy, and he worked hard. I mean, he was a farmer. It was not what he wanted to do. When he came to America, he worked as a laborer and immigrant the rest of his life. Never got back to farming again. It was a tragedy. That he didn't. It was his life, between the animals, the horses, and crops, and growing things. But he was very proud of what he accomplished, and one of the jobs he held was Grandview Dairy, the backbreaking work of loading trucks for delivery in Manhattan and Queens. And I have his jumpsuit. I remember one day he came over the house, And I have all this stuff, and I was probably college age. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and I have his white jumpsuit labeled Merino, Grandview Dairy. And I still have it. I can't fit it anymore. I put on his jumpsuit and I slapped that patch on because we have a picture of him wearing it as he's loading a truck. One sketchy picture. And it was one of the few times, probably the only time I saw him start to cry. And his father was Leonardo. And he loved his father. And I don't get the sense he knew his father very well. Leonardo was killed in the First World War. And when men went into the military back then, they would make a mirror for the family to remember the service. This is when you entered the military. And Leonardo was deployed with his brothers to here, Altipiano di Asiago in northern Italy, in Monte Zebio, and he was killed June 11th, 1917, in World War I. Grandpa is devastated. It changed his life forever because, like he said, they took my father and they gave me this. He said, this is what I have to remember him by, and that medal. And there's a level of disgust, that a life was squandered. He was sent to fight a war he didn't know anything about. He was a farm guy, a farm kid, with his brother deployed to a completely different area of Italy without any discussion, and he never came home. And it changed everyone's life and ended Leonardo's life. So we have pictures and a few things to remember him by. I'm not even sure how much my grandpa remembered him, but he did remember missing his father. And he was raised by his grandfather. So I look at that and I can see my dad's face. If you look closer, you do. You see my dad's face, and that's who my dad's named after, Leonardo. So I keep these. They're important to my grandfather. As we move on here, let me grab this one book out because Claire recently pulled this out for me. One of the things about this office is it's a treasure trove for the kids. So they'll come in here and find things, and then, and I mentioned earlier, lecturing your kids on something is one way to deliver information, but it's usually not retained, I find. But letting them pull something off a shelf and saying, "What's this about?" And this book was important to me because my parents took us on one of our trips to explore New York City. And there was a book fair, and my dad pulled me aside and said, "I think you'll like this book." And really, it's one of my favorite books. This is from 1971, so I was 7 years old because back then everything got labeled. You had a date and name on everything. So here's Nicky Marino, 1971. And this book attempted to explain complex things to a child. Everything from how does a vacuum cleaner work to how does a car work. So here they explain the mechanics of a car for a child to understand. And I literally used this book growing up to fix things because we fixed everything in the house. We didn't call repair people in. So if you had the washing machine broke or the TV broke, I would go upstairs. I would pull this out. Here's the vacuum cleaner explaining how there's a motor and a belt. And I'd take apart the family vacuum cleaner based on this and this description and try to make it work. So this book was very important to me growing up and explained a lot of confusing things like how do airplanes fly. So Claire came in here one day asking questions. She pulled it off, and that to me is one of the best gifts. Is her coming in here using the book I used and answering her own question: how does an airplane fly? And my response is, I don't know. Why don't you look it up in this book over here? So I saved this book, even though it's a bit old, 1971. This is my first microscope. So this is the first brainwashing getting me to go into science. My parents bought this for me. And like my parents said, if you take care of things, it'll last forever. So it wasn't that long ago, Grace came in here and we said, let's plug it in and see if it works. And not only do I have the microscope, I have the case that it came in, labeled Nicky Marino because everything gets labeled, and of course all the slides that you need, the prepared slides to look at, bacteria, things like that, everything a kid wants, different types of bacteria and fungi. And we sat here and looked at slides in my first microscope. This was the beginning of everything right here, and it still works because I kept it clean, oiled, and ready for action. I never got the genetic swath for music, and I never captured it for art. I tried. So here was my gift to my mother, and this hung in my mother's office her entire existence, and my dad gave it to me after she died. This was drawn in 1971, and it says Mother's Day, spelled incorrectly by Nicky Marino. So I was 7 years old, and the project at school was to draw a picture of your mother, and that was my rendition of my mother, Agatha. Agatha Jane Marino. My mom was proud of it. And I knew she was proud of it because it hung up in her office. I think my dad might have mentioned, well, taking trips to Broadway shows like Grease. You know, these were some of our memories growing up is seeing some of these shows. Of course, I don't know what years these were, but it had to be in the 70s. And you asked about religion and dogs, and here it is. This is our dog Ginger died, and she died in 1970, so I was 6 years old back then. So we buried our dog in our backyard because that's what you did back then, and I made this sign, and then it got nailed to a piece of wood, and then a stake put in the ground. This sat in our backyard. We had a dog graveyard. My father didn't say no. He just shook his head and he said, let him do it. And this says, Lord Ginger died November 14th, 1970. She got hit by a car. I remember making this sign. So unlike me, who didn't inherit the talent for art, my daughter Jane happened to. So this is Jane. That's me corrupting her with a flair towards Italy. And Jane, one of Jane's school projects. So my room is adorned with their projects, much the way my mom was proud of my projects and demonstrated that by hanging it up in her office. My office is full of projects that my kids made for me. And one of the things they like to do is tease me because I have no artistic talent or no music talent. So here is my version. This is from 1968. When I was 4 years old, my parents gave us each what's called a scribbler. And we were told to draw. Just draw and create. Do whatever you want to do. And we would sit there and draw our best version of pictures. This is me at 4. And that's me drawing a picture of my Uncle Nino, who back then was a fascination to us. He lived in Italy, and we get these unusual packages periodically from Uncle Nino. And that was me drawing my Uncle Nino. And that was me drawing Shirley Jones from the Partridge Family on a TV show. So as you can see, Jane inherited the bulk of the artistic talent, not me. She had some generation skipping, because that's my version of Winnie the Pooh. And then when we contrast that with Jane's scribbler, which is really a portfolio of her work, you can see Jane got a lot more artistic talent. So Jane drew a few of these items, and I asked her to share them with me so I can show how she was spared my genetics. That's my dog, Tuggy. And there's Jane drawing Winnie the Pooh, just to contrast the talent difference between the two. So my office, are we allowed to swing that direction?
We are.
Just that one picture on the wall.
Which one?
Well, it's not that important. They're all. It's that really that one picture. I mean, Holy Family too. You know, I'm a Holy Family graduate. I went to Holy Family High School, and it really started a life friendship with dozens of people that we talk to several times a week. Our group from Holy Family, and they're very close to me. They're like brothers to me, and we're there for each other through thick and thin. And to not mention Holy Family High School and the friends I've made: Paul Esposito, Lance Rohrecker, Steve Alou. Kevin Devine, Mike Giuliano, these guys are like brothers. Ed Barteski. There's literally 20 or 30 guys that are in regular contact. So Holy Family's been a big part of my life. And oddly, an odd coincidence, Holy Family was bought by St. Anthony's, which is where my kids are going to school now. So it's kind of nice to be in the same building again.
If you had to apply the medical Latin term for the condition you have of collecting memorabilia, what would it be?
I would say being Italian. Being Italian, because to me that says it all. And there's that phraseology, or there's a poem that circulates on the internet about how you feel sorry for the others, because when you grow up Italian, it means growing up with family. It means an open book. It means being expressive. It means a lot of things. Grandparents are not people you see once in a while. Grandparents are part of your lives. They raise you. They're part of your family. A big influence in my life are my grandparents, on both sides of the family, and for different reasons. They brought different elements together for me. I didn't grow up an artist, but Salvatore Costa somehow pokes his head into my life.
Your dad also collects memorabilia.
I didn't notice.
Yeah. Is it? Is it in the genealogy? Is it in the genes?
You know, I don't think I've been to an Italian's house that doesn't look like this, and others stare at it and say, what are you doing? But when I went to visit the relatives in Italy, besides the kiss on both sides of the cheek, the first thing that we saw was that, and then we saw the pictures, and then we went to the cemetery to see the relatives, and it was that all over again. Everyone's proud of where you came from. And they immediately said, you see that chair you're sitting in? That's Grandpa Marino's chair. When he left Italy, he gave us his furniture. That's his dining room set. And Grandpa was sitting there saying, I remember this stuff. So that type of, I don't know, it just keeps us connected. I know they're objects.
Now, did your dad start collecting this for you when you were a kid? And you just started it, or it just happened?
I can go to my dad's house and find the baseball mitt he played with in high school. I could go to my dad's house and find, when my child was born, first child, Grace, was born, my dad showed up at the hospital to say congratulations, and he pulled out the invoice from when I was born from the same hospital and said, when you were born it cost $300 or $400, and here's the invoice, and it said born male Marino, and here's the bill. So he saves everything, probably at a level worse than mine. The last thing I'm going to point to is this picture. This is this collie picture. This was on running errands with my mom, and there was a local artist at the supermarket, and she was painting away, and I just looked at that picture with my affinity towards animals. All of us kids had this love for animals, but when we saw that picture, my mom picked it out, and that picture hung in my room my entire childhood. And along with that picture was that lamp up there, the horse lamp. That we skated by, but on this lamp was my set of keys, and the keys always hung on the tail. So the keys are in a box right now; they're not here, but the keys to the car always hung on the tail of the horses. And that horse head lamp was my bedroom lamp. And oddly, in the box where I have the keys is the replacement lamp, because if you take care of everything, it lasts forever. So the backup shade, in case this gets damaged, is still wrapped in plastic, and I have it to replace this if it ever got damaged. Which, if I take care of it, it'll last forever.
Now, are your girls collecting too now?
Yeah, much to the dismay of my wife, they are. They are. And if you go to their rooms, you'll see that. And I'm good with that. I'm good with that. I think it's a good thing. When I got a little older, my grandmother, I was getting ready to go to college.